When the lights they fade behind us now, there is no time.
And welcome to this week's episode of the Good Dram Show with me, Chris Goodrum. As per usual, a big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode of the show, liked, commented, all that kind of stuff. Yep, I thought it was a good episode of the show. Always enjoy doing an American episode of the show. Don't often get the opportunity, as I said, to do a whole episode of the show on rye bottlings, but yeah, I managed to get them together. Incidentally, discovered earlier in the week that the Knob Creek rye now actually is sporting an age statement. It's now a 7-year-old, so maybe I should have waited until I could use a sample of that rather than the older one. But anyway, I still thought it was a good episode of the show. Anyway, on to this week's episode of the show. As you can see, this is episode number 599. So yes, next week's episode will be a bit of another one of those landmark episodes of the show, and hopefully I'll do something that will befit that number. But anyway, in all of those 599 episodes of the show that I've done so far, I've never done an episode on Glengoyne. And you're probably saying, well, why haven't you done an episode on Glengoyne? It's because it's just not a distillery that I really enjoy. There are a number of distilleries that I absolutely love, and then there's a number of distilleries that produce an industrial style of whisky, and I have lumped them together all in one lovely little group that I tend to call the Axis of Evil, as you well know. And you've got things like sort of Deanston and so on and so forth that produce a very similar style, and you know, I just don't enjoy it. So you're probably thinking, well, why are you actually going to do an episode of the show on Glengoyne? You're just going to trash it, aren't you? And well, no, the honest answer is not. I always sort of approach tasting any whiskey, any distillery, whether I like it, the distillery or not, with a completely open mind, because sometimes, you know, as they say, every dog has its day, and you just never know. And the main reason for doing this week's episode of the show is that Paul, the sales director for Ian MacLeod Distillers, who purchased the distillery I think in 2003, kindly dropped in a couple of months ago and was trying to sell me on the virtues of Glengoyne, and I was thinking, good luck on that one, mate. But he kindly sorted me out some samples, and I thought, well, maybe I should explain why I'm not a particular big fan of Glengoyne. Anyway, the distillery itself was built in 1833, and it's actually quite a pretty little distillery, I suppose, in the grand scheme of things, which kind of runs counter to the Goodrum first law of whisky, which says pretty distillery equals pretty malt. Obviously, that doesn't always follow that way. The reverse often does, you know. Distillery looks like a tin shack. Yeah, you kind of get my drift on that one. But anyway, now, the Glengoyne again make a very traditional style of spirit, and I use the term in inverted commas, which lends itself nicely to maturation in sherry casks. And unlike some of the other traditional distilleries that tend to use an inordinate amount of sherry casks, Glengoyne do actually bottle in ex-American oak. You can see it in their own bottling they have, which I'm obviously tasting today and going to start off with, which is wholly aged in ex-American oak. But also the independents have a tendency to, or did, bottle it single American oak casks and often seem to have this fetish for bottling it at less than 10 years of age, and you go, ooh, sharp intake of breath, less than 10-year-old. I mean, part of the problem, I mean, not really a problem, but part of the reason why Glengoyne has that kind of quite sort of industrial style is its fermentation, the wort fermentation. Well, they practice two. One is 56 hours, I believe, and the other is a 110-hour fermentation. Now, I think the reason they do 110-hour fermentation is because they basically go home at the weekend and leave the stuff fermenting until the Monday morning, rather than doing it out of design. Whether the wort is then collected and distilled individually, I honestly don't know. But apparently they, according to the blurb, they attempt to maximise copper contact. They have both stills have boil, or all three of their stills that they have boil balls, but they also have descending linarms as well. So it's kind of, again, here we are, the sort of toss up between sort of, you know, reflux and, you know, getting the sort of the impurities that they actually want. They also use shell and tube condensers, which is, again, you would consider to be more of a sort of a stripping out more of the impurities, and so ending up with a lighter spirit. And in some instances, the general rule of thumb is that their new make is very light and crisp and fresh and grassy and citric, you know, in that kind of almost kind of spey-like kind of style. But I often find it's really hard work. It's oily, it's industrial, and sometimes it's downright rough. So it either means that the cut points are being a bit sort of, you know, variable, shall we say, or they're using this, you know, the more sort of fermented wort. Yeah, I doubt if they do that. I don't think that they do the sort of the wort separately. So I think it's probably all basically down to cut points and producing a style of whiskey that's going to sort of work with sherry. Because at the end of the day, as we all know, your nice light feet, you know, Glengoyne, for example, Tiernish, that kind of stuff, shove it into sherry and completely and utterly disappears. You don't often even get a semblance of spirit character. Glengoyne maybe, because it has a bit of weight to it, but Tiernish just gets kind of swamped, and some of the other lighter spays also. So there has been some interesting bottlings of Glengoyne, and I did mention it to Paul. I think it was back in the early 2000s that before Ian MacLeod purchased the distillery. They did a couple of Scottish oak finished releases. I think there was a 15-year-old which was bottled as a cask strength, and then there was a subsequent 2 years later, I think a 16-year-old they released, which didn't have quite so much oak character. I assumed that the casks had been reused, and therefore they were, or a proportion of them weren't virgin anymore. Yeah, it was interesting. It kind of worked with the Glengoyne spirit. That sort of the oak gave it this kind of very intense, sappy kind of character, and it kind of worked with that sort of, you know, slightly hard-edged spirit. And I guess that's it. You know, it's your spirit. You know, you try and sort of match it with the cask and get it to sort of harmonise with that. But anyway, I think I've done sort of a fair amount of waffling. Like I said, it's you probably think, well, I'm not going to be particularly sort of kind to Glengoyne, and you know, the thing is, whenever I taste, you know, whiskey, doesn't matter where it's from, what distillery, what I think of the distillery, that's completely irrelevant to me. I will just judge the whiskey on what is in the glass and how it makes me feel, and, you know, the quality of it. Everything else is kind of noise, and at the end of the day, sometimes, as they say, every dog will have its days. So on that note, let's have a look at today's lineup. Paul kindly sent me this lovely little sample pack called the Glengoyne Time Capsule, 3 5cl samples. If you're intrigued and want to know what the Glengoyne character is like without having to fork out for a whole bottle, then picking up one of them. I think they also do them in 20cl sizes as well. So, like I said, you know, if you want to sort of like dip your toe in the Glengoyne water, then you know, pick up a sample pack. And we're going to start off with the first of the bottlings from that. This is the Glengoyne White Oak. It's bottled at 48%, so non-chill filtration, no colouring, as you can see, perfectly natural. Aged in a combination of ex-bourbon casks and ex-virgin American oak. Then we're going to do a run of 3 independent bottlings, because like I said, the Indies did seem to have a bit of a fetish for bottling Glengoyne at sub 10, so you can experience the full impact of the spirit, I guess. So the first one we're going to look at is a 7-year-old. This is a Hunter Laing Hepburns Choice. It was distilled in June of 2007, bottled in June of 2014, so yes, that is a bit of an old sample. Bottled at 46%. The internal code was HEP0040, which means absolutely nothing to any of you guys, because those, like I say, it was an internal code. Next bottle we'll be looking at is an AD Rattray single cask Glengoyne. This is 12 years old. Now the sample that I have here was actually at cask strength at 58%, but it was bottled at 46. They cut it down to 46. It was a single bourbon cask, 1289, distilled in April of 98, bottled in February of 2011. Yeah, it's been hanging around for a while, and like I said, bottled at 46%. And this was the thing about AD Rattray, they would often tend to do this. I assume that sometimes, well, I know sometimes that they used to send out the samples kind of asking for a bit of feedback, whether they thought that was that particular bottling was better at cask strength, or whether it would be better bottled at 46%. And I think sometimes they bottled them according to the feedback that they received. So that one was bottled at 46%. Number 4 in today's lineup is a Douglas McGibbon Provenance Glengoyne, a 13-year-old, a refill bourbon hoggy. It is DMG 9517, distilled in December of 1999, bottled in March of 2013 at 46%. And then we're going to head back into the final two from the time capsule. This is the Glengoyne 12-year-old, 43% this time, so obviously chill filtered, and well, I don't think it's been coloured. Aged in both combination of American oak and sherry. From tasting it in the past, I think the sherry component is relatively light, and so like a lot of the distilleries, it seems to sort of increase the amount of sherry as you go up the age statement. So when you get to the 15-year-old, for example, again unfortunately bottled at 43%, probably more sherry, as you can see from the colour, slightly darker, but not a huge amount in actual fact. And then you have the 21 that used to be pretty heftily sherried. I think they still do a 21, but anyway, I haven't got a sample of that for today. So that's today's little lineup. Let's kick off with the White Oak then, shall we? Right, okay, so let's see what the White Oak gives us then, shall we? Whew, I've just got quite an alcohol prickle there. That's quite a surprise for 48%. Anyway, it's quite earthy, it's edgy, there's a sort of a slight kind of acerbic, citric, herbal, barley, raw barley. It's really quite young, white licorice, lot of oak tannins, not quite so much creamy oak, but more tannic oak. There's a little bit of lemon, touch of toffee now coming through. It's actually not too industrial, and this is, I think, part of the thing that sometimes Glengoyne doesn't come across like that. Maybe the virgin oak casks are fairly heavily charred, and maybe they've taken out a lot of the impurities off the back, possibly. I mean, it is there. There is that sort of Glengoyne character, you know, and at the end of the day, that's what you want. You want a distillery to tell you about the character of its spirit. Whether you subsequently like said character or not, of course, is another matter. But I always love whiskey that gives me characteristics, that give me distillery character. So, as a standalone bottling, I'm not a huge fan, but I think if you want to experience Glengoyne without sort of, you know, experiencing too much Glengoyne, it's quite well balanced. The oak is quite, like I said, more tannic than creamy, but yes, it's an okay nose. Actually, quite pleasant, I think, for a Glengoyne. See what the pass like. Quite full, quite barley. Oak is a little bit more creamy. Quite tense on the finish. Mid palate, yes, I'm getting some of that kind of slightly raw cereals, a little bit industrial, a little bit hard, but I'm also getting some green fruit, some citrus, green apple, marzipan, a little bit of marzipan, unsweetened marzipan. Again, the oak isn't adding very much sweetness, it's adding a little bit more tannin, it's certainly adding structure to the whiskey. It is what it is at the end of the day. It's actually quite a pleasant expression of Glengoynes. I have come across Glengoynes that really do have a lot more industrial character than that. And so, you know, I'm pleasantly surprised by that one, I think. So, yeah, good stuff. So let's move on to the next bottling. This is the 7-year-old Hepburns Choice. Let's see what the nose gives on this one, shall we? Right, that's pretty intense. Sort of white stone fruits, citrus, a little bit of barley. There's a little bit of a slight kind of white wine vinegar note. That note is becoming kind of quite more noticeable. Yeah, it's becoming quite astringent. It doesn't have an inordinate amount of character aside from that kind of astringency, and it's a little bit on the thin side. Let's see what the palate like. Young, rose petally, a little bit of mar, a little bit of almost cardboard there coming through on the mid palate. Not a great deal on the finish, it has to be said. It's fairly insubstantial, but it does give you the green fruit and the citrus that sort of a lot of people kind of say is a characteristic of Glengoyne. So in this instance, it is showing that element, but it's kind of just way too young, it has to be said. So let's move on to the AD Rattray Glengoyne. So this is 12 years old. Let's see what the nose gives on this then, shall we? Quite spirity. Touch of toasted, almost burnt caramel. Marzipan, quite a lot of oak. Again, there's a little bit of a raw spirit note underneath, but mainly getting oak, it has to be said. There's a slight kind of almost metallic note right at the edge. Again, we're kind of in that sort of edginess, I suppose. It's kind of, you know, bit citric, but quite heavily oak, lots of oak in actual fact. And it's almost like the kind of oak is trying to sort of overlay that sort of edginess, that rawness. Let's see what it passes on. Oaky, quite masked. I mean, it sort of doesn't give you much beyond the start. It's sort of the middle palate kind of like is starting to go, it has to be said, insofar that the alcohol is kind of is rather intrusive. There's a little bit of caramel. Again, we've got that slight sort of citric note. It's a bit edgy. There's a slight soapiness right on the finish. It's a hard one to like, this one, it has to be said. I'm going to put a little drop of water with it and see what that does to it, because as I said, this was bottled at 46%, and I imagine that a lot of people probably said bottle at 46%. So let's see what a little drop of water does to the nose. Yeah, it's still fairly oaked. I mean, there's a little bit more citrus, there's a bit more flesh to it, I suppose. A little bit more barley, less oak. It's still quite taut, still quite citric. It's still not a nose that I'm actually falling in love with, it has to be said. It is still hard work. Let's see what it passes right now. A little bit sweeter, a bit more vanilla, a bit more oak in actual fact. Calming the alcohol down as kind of or not, as the case may be. It's certainly brought out the oak. It's a softer, slightly creamier mouthfeel to it. Again, there's that sort of edginess, that industrial edginess, citric note as well. Again, it's not a bottling I kind of warm to, as we said, and I think that even though this was bottled at 12 years old, really I think that could have done with a fair few years more in the cask, to be honest with you.
In this world so bitter and cold.
Right, okay, so let's move on to the Douglas McGibbon Provenance Glengoyne, so 13 years old, 46%. Let's see what nose gives on this thing, shall we? Okay, that's quite well balanced actually. Again, stony white fruits, quite granity, very Highland in actual fact. And this is the first nose I've actually noticed that kind of granity Highland character. A little bit of youthful rose petal, touch of pepper, nicely balanced oak. You know, I would go as far as saying that with the sort of Glengoyne White Oak, it's actually quite well balanced. The oak is doing its job in so far that it is kind of taking your some of the rawness away and adding, which is what it should do. It should add the sort of softness and the structure, and it should stop the spirit becoming too sort of lean and what have you. But and so in this instance, yeah, it's not too shabby. Let's see what that's like. Okay, so it kicks off again with that. It's actually quite nicely bookended by that sort of minerally granity sort of Highland character. It kicks off with it and it finishes with it. And in the mid palate you get some creaminess, some oak, a little bit of barley, white stone fruits, a little bit of rose petal. Yeah, okay, I don't mind that at all. Again, it's not a whiskey that I would want to sort of go, yeah, I'll have another glass of that. One is far enough as far as I'm concerned. But I think it's actually quite nicely balanced, and it's got some nice progression. Like I said, it starts with the Highland character, ends with the Highland character, and in the middle, sandwiched between the two, is a bit of oak. Yeah, okay, that's not too bad. Right, okay, so on to the second of the distillery bottlings. This is the Glengoyne 12-year-old. Let's see what the nose gives on this one, shall we? Right, so you can pick up quite obviously the influence of the sherry, but it's not overly sherried. It still allows plenty of that green fruit, that stringent green fruit, cereal, unripened pineapple, malt, a little bit of toasted oak, touch of that sort of sherry dried fruit, the Oloroso dried fruit. Again, not too industrial in actual fact. The oak is again doing its job, hiding some of that industrial character, and just allowing sort of like the green fruit notes and the sort of little bit of Highland minerality to come through. Again, it's just, it is a hard nose to love. I mean, it's not horrible by any stretch of the imagination, and I think I would certainly prefer this to the independent bottlings, because I think it's another one of those kind of spirit distilleries that really does benefit from a bit of sherry cask. And you know, people seem to think that I've got it in for sherry matured whiskies, and I hate all sherried whiskies, but I don't. I think, you know, judicious use of sherry cask sometimes works absolute wonders, and in this instance I think it really does benefit the spirit. It works well with it. Let's see what the pass like. Soft, oily. I think the sort of the chill filtration has removed a lot of that kind of astringent character, because it's very soft, it's very oily, it's very toffeed. Interesting enough, I get kind of both sweet and unsweetened toffee. I get the dried sherried fruits. I get quite a nice kind of minerality on the right on the aftertaste, but it's also got that slight metallic edge to it as well. a little bit of spice, some cereal. I really think that this probably, I would have liked to have seen it at 46. I can see why it's bottled at 43. It's all about the balance of price versus ABV, isn't it, at the end of the day? And I suppose, you know, 43% is a kind of good middle ground. You know, because a lot of distilleries opt for the old 40%, which I think is probably far too low these days. So 43 is a kind of good compromise, I guess. Personally, I really think it should be 46%. And I think the chill filtration has kind of, I mean, maybe that's what they were aiming for. Maybe they wanted to just kind of take the edge off the distillery character and make it seem more approachable, possibly. I don't know. These are all decisions that get made sort of further up the food chain, I think. But it's all right. It's, I suppose, got distillery character, but again, like I said, it's kind of softened at the edges. So, yeah, it is what it is.
At the bottom of the ocean.
Okay, so let's move on to the 15. Let's see what the nose gives on this end, shall we? Okay, so it is showing some mature sherry character. I'm getting oxidation, a little dusty sort of American oak, some spice, herbal toffee. Again, there's that sort of slightly industrial barley character underneath the oak. And again, I think it's well balanced. You know, the oak is not too intrusive. It's certainly taking the edge off the industrial character of the spirit. There's a little bit of marzipan, a little bit of fudge. Yeah, okay. The criminal bit, I think, is the 43%. At the 15-year-old, I really do think you should be bottling at 46. I mean, I don't know what this retails for, but most 15-year-olds, what are they retailing for? Anywhere, oh, you know, it's a bit of a wild west at the moment, but what, 70, 80 quid maybe? I really think that this should have been bottled at 46, because at that kind of price point, a few extra quid ain't going to make a great deal of difference. But yeah, let's see what that's like. I hate to say it, but the ABV, or the lack of ABV, is really noticeable on the palate. It's pleasant, it's nice, it's soft. I wouldn't quite go as far as saying watery. I mean, if this was bottled at 40%, it would be really, really light. Yes, it's a bit homogeneous. There's some pleasant marzipan notes, there's some sherry dried fruit, there's a little bit of green fruit, there's a little bit of kind of astringent notes kind of coming through, but it's all a bit kind of blunted and lacking in intensity, whereas the kind of like the white oak bottling gave it to you. It's kind of 48%, it gave you the distillery character, whereas this doesn't. It's all a bit kind of nice, and really Glengoyne is not nice, is it really, at the end of the day? You know, if I want sort of distillery character, I want distillery character. If you give it to me. I mean, that's what I want. Give me the distillery character. I mean, I might not like it, but at least you're giving it to me on a plate, you know, rather than this kind of slightly half-hearted kind of like, yeah, right, nice, we're trying to make it kind of rounded and everybody would like it, and therefore you overly compromise your spirit at the end of the day by trying to make it appeal to too many people. Now I know it might sound stupid, because as a distillery you obviously want to sell your whiskey, you want to sell it to as many people as possible, so you want it to appeal to as many people as possible, but sometimes by doing that you end up with, I hate to say it, homogeny. Okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show. Firstly, a big thank you to Paul from Ian McLeod Distillers for the samples for today's episode of the show. I don't think they'll be running out the bunting for this this review somehow, but in saying that, I think it's been a really interesting episode of the show, and you know, I am forever curious, even though I've been doing this for more years than I care to remember now. I still have a curiosity, and I want to know about the distillery. And first off, I have to say, you cannot say that these bottlings do not exhibit distillery character. So on that point, I applaud the distillery for what they're doing. And actually, I think their most successful bottling is the White Oak. I mean, you get the distillery character, you get the astringency, the citrus, the slight rawness, the industrial character. You get some oak to back that up. It's not overly creamy, it's quite tannic, it's got good structure, it's bottled at the right ABV. It's what they should be doing at the end of the day, you know, and that for me is a good bottling to just understand what Glengoyne is all about at the end of the day. The Hepburns Choice 7-year-old, yeah, well, it's just too young at the end of the day. And like I said, I never understood sort of Hunter Laing and Douglas Lang's obsession with bottling Glengoyne at under 10 years of age. I think they just kind of thought it was a, you know, well, I don't know what they thought. The AD Rattray bottling, the 12-year-old, again, not the greatest cask of Glengoyne that I've ever come across. It has to be said, certainly worked a lot better once it was diluted down to, well, I mean, approximately what it would have been at 46%. Cask strength, it was all a bit too intense and a bit sort of like ho-hum, has to be said. And I thought I suppose for an indie bottling, American oak single cask jobby, the Provenance was okay. It was actually quite nicely balanced. And you got the distillery character, you got a little bit of oak, so from that point of view, like I keep saying, you can't argue that it wasn't showing character, whether you like that or not. And the bottling was okay. I was sort of maybe on the fence, or maybe it was okay. I would have been more than happy if somebody had given me a bottle of that. It might have sat in the back of the cupboard for a while and come out every now and again like a naughty child, but you know, I wouldn't have gone, no, what the hell are you doing to me? The 12-year-old, the distillery 12-year-old, okay, yeah, it is what it is at the end of the day. And I think it perfectly encapsulates how Glengoyne does actually work quite nicely with a bit of sherry, because it kind of takes your mind off some of the character of the spirit, but it still had plenty of character. There was enough there. 43% was okay for that particular bottling. And yeah, it is what it is at the end of the day. The 15-year-old was a bit of a disappointment, mainly down to the ABV, and it just turned it into a bit of a kind of overly. They attempted to be too safe with it. Like I said, they tried to appeal to a broad base, and in doing so, kind of neutered the whiskey itself by filtering it and bottling it at 43%. So I would have gone at 46%, possibly even higher, possibly 50%, you know, because like I said, if this is going to hit the shelves at 70, 90 quid, or somewhere between those 2 points of view, that's what the customers expect these days. Certainly customers that are going to be buying that kind of level of whiskey and are going to have the money to spend on that kind of level of whiskey, that's what they're looking for, you know. It's not always a sign of quality, and it isn't a sign of quality really at the end of the day, but it is a sign of intent, and it is a sign that the distillery takes their older spirit pretty seriously, and you know, takes the sort of the customers wants particularly seriously, rather than just sort of like maximising the spirit for profit at the end of the day. But yeah, anyway. That's just my opinion. Anyway, so that's this week's episode of The Show in the Bag. I think it's been really intriguing. Like I said, I always enjoy, to a certain extent, having a look at distilleries that I'm not the world's biggest fan of, because every now and again they do surprise you, but there's also a reason why they do what they do. And, you know, I think unless you have to be objective about these things, and hopefully that's exactly what I have been. So, Until next week and episode number 600, whatever that's going to sort of bring, I have no idea. I'll have to give it some serious thought, as we said. Until then, all that's left to say is good afternoon and good dramming.